Good day, all, everywhere. Now here. Jana and Harry and I are here. Gabe is coming in a bit, and we may have other people peeking in or poking in, dropping in and out. Jana, you were just starting to say something.
Yeah, I was just reading The Lightness of Being warned us that life allows us no revision or second drafts, and this could be unbearable, but it could also be liberating. I guess the liberating part is that we just concede to what is.
Well, and the interesting idea is that to the idea of thinking, things that matter more seem to be more important, but they also come with the gravitational weight of matter, which we bear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was pointing to the fact that the unbearable lightness of being, that was Milan Kundera in the book named The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but he was talking about that. The difficulty in dealing with, in the midst of our human experience, is absolute nature that has no weight to it. And it can seem unbearable because there's really nothing to bear. The fact is, it's the easiest thing to bear because there's no bearing. There's literally no weight, and it's pure light. And if you think of light, it doesn't weigh much. The brighter it gets does not cause us to feel like we're being crushed, but more lit up. So he's a, incredible writer that could put words to things that I imagine we all have some degree of struggle with. But he's also pointing to the fact in this, the lightness of being warned us that life allows no revisions or second drafts, that every moment is complete and whole on its own. And the newness of the now moment is also complete and whole on its own. It doesn't come with any of the tailings that we might think it does historically. It's actually that freedom to recognize the responsibility and the choices in the present that can seem unbearable when we thought we'd fixed it, resolved it, and desensitized ourselves to the potential of it in some past way that we're still historically maintaining in our thinking. It isn't to suggest we can't have memory and think of things that we've done and use that as a basis to be able to do other things similarly and better as a result. But the fact is, we're still free to complete, we're technically always starting over, all the time. It's always new. It's always, all possibility is always possible. We're not committed to any of the previous ideas we've had or any of the moments that no longer exist. So the liberation is saying that, oh, I've got the freedom all the time. The choices I make is what gives me the sense of weight and matter and how I see things, which was also, in Buddha's quote, no, sorry, it wasn't Buddha. Let me, there was something else that Stoics during the, let me see if I can find that. Stoics talked about the fact that we primarily control our responses to everything that is happening, which is exactly what we talk about. And their suggestion and their basic outline was to respond with discipline, courage, justice, and wisdom. And I would suggest that all of those characteristics include is what intuition is. Good morning, Santiago and Gabe.
Morning.
Welcome to the day.
Thanks.
So I was just talking to Jana about the Stoics, and I read this past week that they suggest, and the Stoics basically are talking about the fact that we primarily control our own responses to everything that's happening. It's the one thing that we're doing. And my sense is that our responses when they're addicted are reactions. They're not responses. They're seemingly automatic, happening to us, not being caused by us. And that's the disjointed nature of that thinking that goes with that chronic mental addiction. But what they suggested, the Stoics, was to respond with discipline, courage, justice, and wisdom. And all of those would fall in line with the steps in terms of principles, or even the serenity prayer. Accept the things we cannot change. Have the courage to change the things we can. When I'm not discouraging, literally discouragement is the absence of courage. When I'm not discouraging my experience by thinking about trying to change things I can't change, I naturally have courage. I naturally have wisdom. I naturally have intuition because I already have it. I'm just conflating it or confusing it with the experience I'm creating in my thinking and the intoxication I have with that experience. And feeling consumed by it gives me the impression there's nothing else I can do. And I'm creating that. I'm actually creating an excuse not to be responsible and accountable for what I'm actually doing. Which may be a lot for on Kundera's comment that the lightness of being warned us that life allows no revisions or second drafts. And this could be unbearable, but it could also be liberating. And my suspicion is he's referring there to this addiction, to the idea it's the only thing we can do is bear this weight that seems to be impossible and unbearable, rather than see that the actual lightness of being has no weight whatsoever. And what we're really struggling with is all that we think is reality, rather than actual reality, which has no weight to it whatsoever. So it's just a transition of thought. How am I accounting for what's happening now is the experience I'm creating. And if I think that experience, because I'm wrong, happens to be how those things are out there and how reality is, I'm once again revealing this backward thinking that comes with addictive thinking or any addictive action. It's always doing the wrong thing in the name of it being right, and also in the name of it being the only thing I can do. So I think I'm a scapegoat and use the goats as a blame and shame, rather than my own choices, my own activities, my own decisions. Thoughts?
I'm scared to think.
Aren't we all?
That's very funny. Well, at least we could laugh at that rather than think that's actually a condition that's insurmountable and impossible to ever overcome.
Well, that's true. That's definitely progress.
Yeah, I mean, seeing stuff accurately begins to see the freedom of it. If freedom is a natural, absolute state of being, and it becomes laughable rather than thinking of it as something we take offensively because we take it personally, thinking that the person we create and this idea we have about who we are is offended by that, which suggests, in my experience, that that offended personality is in fact defensive, naturally defensive. And there's no need for defense in something that's absolute because it is not at risk. It doesn't change because I think of it differently, or we all believe that it doesn't exist. Like in Buddha's quote, truth is truth, whether we believe it or not, and a lie is a lie, no matter how many people believe it. So if that's a still meaning remaining, ever present, Milan Kundera is referring to that moment of that we're in, the absolute present state of that presence, and whether or not it's cluttered with the weightiness of what we may think is reality, but in fact is just simply a almost depressing impression. Depends on how long the impression's been maintained, I expect, before we think of it as depressing. But the impressions we're creating are evidence that they're weighty, that they have some matter in them. And it doesn't mean we can't think things matter, but when we think of them that way, we're thinking of them, we're the ones thinking of that. They don't have that weight on their own. We're giving them that weight in our experience. Mental addiction uses that sense of fear for what we're doing and claiming we're not doing as justification to continue doing what we're doing, thinking we can do nothing else but that. Like we've bullied our own experience into submission to continue doing the wrong thing in the name of hoping one day it will be right, and yet it's never today, never now. It's never right now because it isn't right. Just a thought. As thought trying to escape the landscape we create for it in our own thoughts. The narrative we're running, the story we're telling. And I would suggest that fear is a clear awareness, though we are mistaking it and mislabeling it to justify thinking it isn't what it is, but it's a clear awareness that we know better to be feeling those things as wrong and feeling those things as something that are tenuous and difficult to deal with. So every day is a new day, every day is a new year. All of the things we reduce down to those celebrations are happening on a daily basis. And yet we minimize the days between and maximize those when they finally come, as though they're not happening in the meantime, as though they're some distant thing where we get 2 weeks off. And the Stoics' words about discipline and wisdom and the insight that's offered are really just principles being revealed in the actions taken when we're response able and able to respond, meaning we're considerate in our thoughts and considering our thoughts as thoughts and utilizing them as such rather than thinking of them as the creator of reality and then wondering why we seem to struggle so desperately with reality. Any contemplative thoughts, considerations?
Well, from yesterday, Jack, we were talking about, and maybe it goes to Jana's co-conspirators, but really being flustered by other people's not aligning to my thoughts, my desires, dreams, goals, and being caught in that loop. And then wanting more of the same if it does align and more.
You mean once there is some alignment,
Yeah.
constantly demanding more and more, demanding rather than simply wanting.
Yeah. But in the first step of, demanding in a way or being flustered if it's not aligned with what you believe to be reality and in others. It was about the others of
How
people.
it should be,
Yeah.
rather than how it is. Well, I think the traces of addictive thinking are very easy to spot because they always suggest that something's happening out of us is not being, that we're not involved in it. It's them and there and not here and now. It's always somewhere else with someone else and something else. And I don't think that's unusual because for the most part, as far as I can tell, historically, we've been operating on the basis that our thinking is reality. And you hear people talk about this all the time. You want to manifest your reality as though our reality is distinct from reality. That couldn't be true if reality was real in an absolute sense. There couldn't be a distinct reality that I create, but there could certainly be distinct characteristics of transformative ideas that I have that I can influence and have take shape, like to little perform or transform, like transform existing reality. That's certainly possible. But the idea of creating it is this idea that we're alone with our own and everyone should align with ours, because after all, we're talking about reality from our own point of view. And when other people don't, and that's just unbearable, literally, just as Kundera's talking about. But I think part of what we were getting to yesterday, Gabe, is I can still have those wishes and wants that other people align. And when I'm thinking of them as maligned, I'm really not thinking of the essence of them. I'm thinking of the characteristics of them, once again, being them. So their personalities or characteristics, the choices they make, the behaviors they have, all of a sudden become them. And once again, I'm back into this loop of thinking that who they are is what they do and what they have in terms of a body and a brain and thoughts and behaviors. So I've reduced them to the least possible because I've taken the infinite absolute source from them as though they need to behave like I do before I can give them credit for having that, rather than see that it's my lack of giving them credit that starts that whole reactive, insistent behavior where I'm actually begging them for their worst rather than their best, so I can try to prove how distinctly screwed up they are. And I'm actively involved in that. And I think that was kind of what we were broaching yesterday, if I'm tracking your memory well.
Don't try and track my memory if I can't track my own.
Well,
No.
I was there, so
Track
I'm
your memory,
relying.
not my memory.
Yeah, that was not.
No, I'm joking, Jack.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
it seemed to me we talked about workers on a job. For instance, you're an architect, and berating them for doing things wrong does not tend to draw the best out of them versus beginning to commune with them and say, here's the goal here. Here's what I'd like to see. And how do you feel you can do that? And
yeah, but also like in marriages and other partnerships or parent-child relationships of demanding that they behave in a certain way,
right.
Just leads to more chaos and tension and blaming of them instead of yourself, and those kind of thoughts, misalignments, and then blaming them for being misaligned, like that.
Right. As though you have nothing to do with it. The other thing to look at in that is that if you're blaming yourself, you're taking for granted that the thoughts you have are who you are, because that's the self you're blaming. Because all you're doing is thinking about what they're doing as being something you're not doing, because they're not doing it exactly the way you would do it. So you're looking at the differences, you're looking at the contrasts, you're looking at the behavioral. Their behavior is always going to be somewhat different than the behavior you might imagine, because the way you imagine it would be unique to your own thinking. Right? And certainly cooperation with kids is very welcome. But the idea that it's yourself doing it rather than just seeing that it's actually your thoughts that you believe in to be right and to be true, how could they be right and true and then need to be insisted upon by someone else rather than recognized if they're actually right and true? They already know it. They already have it. That's always already a basis of their awareness. Pure consciousness can't be violated by the simple thought that we have that it isn't pure and it isn't conscious. And so we act unconsciously, acting as though we're not doing what we're doing, which is just an attempt to pretend that that thought, that pure consciousness doesn't exist, is proof of that. So their getting worse actually helps us make the contention that they're the wrong party and we're not. We're getting better while they get worse, which is clearly a conflict. It's the same thing as thinking what's happening isn't happening and it shouldn't be happening simultaneously with it happening. Major conflict. I'm the one seeing it happening. I'm the one witnessing it happening. I'm the one thinking about it happening. And then I'm thinking it shouldn't be happening. And it should be something other than what's happening. Major conflict. Present traumatic stress, I would say. Constantly battling something that we're creating as though we have nothing to do with it. We're seeing the effect as the cause rather than the cause of the thinking. We're doing the basis of the thinking, the belief systems, these seeming fixed ideas that are clearly broken. Called fixed as though they're intractable and inflexible and unable to be changed, when if the moment is always free and always gives us all possibility, which I believe is what Kundera was talking about in terms of it can be, the liberation of it can be very freeing rather than condemning. And it's literally just a perspective shift to see the value in it, the learning curve in it, the ability to look at it and say, oh, wow, that isn't my best to be thinking they're worse and I'm better because they're worse and I'm so righteous. I'm going to continue to blame and shame and fault them until they get straighten out when I'm helping them get worse because I'm doing the exact same thing thinking I have nothing to do with it. And I have a 14-year-old granddaughter who lost her mother a year ago that we're managing. And that's not always easy to maintain that track. So I find love is easy and like is not. You know, there's a lot of dislikes I have, and I don't see them as things I should get rid of, but just start to note that they are, in fact, preferences I've chosen. And in some cases, they're not healthy. And I'm seeing things accurately collectively rather than just an inaccuracy of everything. And all of a sudden thinking I need to see all things I don't like as things I like, simply to make believe that somehow or another I've reached some level of idealism when in fact I'm not functioning properly amongst other people who aren't functioning properly. I'm not seeing things accurately in that regard. So it doesn't mean people aren't wrong simply because we begin to look at the wrong we're doing. If they're wrong, we would be compassionate for that wrong if we're seeing what we're doing clearly rather than think of it as some contemptful, spiteful action on their part that we have to stop at all costs or we can never be at ease and never be at peace. Gets all twisted up. Tangled up in blue, I think Joni Mitchell said. I think part of the other thing, Gabe,
Yeah.
to your point often about the waking up in the morning and still feeling the dread and all that kind of stuff. And I know that you've gone through some major transitions and things aren't the way they were, but those things too, within the context of addiction, the idea was if I do something, it will fix all that stuff once and for all. If I have a drink, if I do a drug, it's going to resolve all that stuff. And while I'm doing that thing, it can seem to be working in that way. But behind the scenes, behind the immediacy of this self-gratification that I'm generating to intoxicate myself with my ability to be consumed by the attention I'm paying to it. Whatever the problem is, isn't getting better because it's being ignored. And it's just festered, like any bacteria is going to grow. And to start getting clearer is to actually have a broader view of the wrong that's happening that is collective and is, in fact, very obvious, rather than make believe, again, going back to this point about making believe that everything should be fine because I have a source that's absolutely fine. And within that source, it is fine. But within my human experience, I'm struggling with issues, and I'm looking at the lack of influence I have in the world and seeing that there are plenty of things that are sort of fractured states coming from this basic idea that we're each creating our own reality and we each represent our own reality and we each wonder why everybody else doesn't get on board with us. Rather than see they're already on board, we're just looking at it improperly, so we're not dealing with it accurately. And as a result, you can't misdiagnose something and then create a prescription for it that will solve the problem. It's always going to miss it and end up perpetuating that problem, whatever it is, whether it's a physical disease or a mental ailment or a relationship that's suffering or struggling. And in our human existence, we're interacting with everything. All the relationships are setting sail all the time. So to start seeing and talking about that, I would say would be a pretty important aspect of it, because it can become what can seem intractable and impossible becomes laughable when it's seen for what it is, which is really just a mirage we've created and literally believe it's true. We believe there's going to be water and oasis if we just crawl through the heat in the desert to get there a little bit longer. So that ultimately is what this conversation is about. How do we utilize the absolute nature of our existence and start operating on that basis rather than on this decrepit idea that all we are is what we think, and we all have this failed self that is completely off its rocker and we're subjected to it as though it has a life of its own and has nothing to do with us. And I think within the context of the Stoics, they're talking about wisdom and intuition and the principled nature of discipline, meaning that we're practicing accurately the interactions that we're having and looking at them from the most practical standpoint, rather than the most obscenely grand idea that everyone else is doing it, we can't ever convince them and forget about it. I'm just going to go back to my path and do more of what I want and the way I want, and think that by sealing myself off, somehow or another I'll be better, or desensitizing my experience and becoming numb has me feel better and am now better than everyone else. If there's a collective, we're all on the same basis. We're all functioning on the absolutely same basis. And to see that begins to unify rather than divide and give this fractured state of behavior. And the word behave too, if you look at it, break it down, is being and having. And if we have a being nature and begin to admit that as something we have, or actually I would say it has us, because we're not choosing it or not choosing it when we're not thinking it's there, it always has us. And then our havingness begins to be expressed in behavior in ways that are productive, because we're adjusting to what's happening and we're looking at what's happening and we're growing and learning from what's happening, rather than fighting it to have it look as though it should look to the one we think we are, separate and apart from it all. Morning, Jackie.
Good morning. Good to see everybody.
You too. So talking about this, rather than reinforcing the problems that come out of the thinking that's wrong, which is easy to do, there's stories, and they're either within the context of human experience, they're going to be either immoral stories, which are excuses being used to justify why I shouldn't be where I am, or I would be somewhere else if it weren't for this, that, or them some other time. Something happened that caused me to be where I am, and I shouldn't be here. While I'm here, in every respect, I shouldn't be here. Think of the human conflict in that. The dread, the sense of displacement, the sense of dislocation. I don't even belong where I am. When it's the only place I've ever been, only place I can be is exactly where I am. And by the way, exactly with what I have, which in absolute terms is everything, which includes all of you and everyone and everything, all that are and all that is. And to mistake that is to launch off on a relationship to things that's corrupt to begin with. So what are we going to do but corruptly think of those things? Turn them into the scapegoats, turn them into the reason, turn us into the victim of all that they're doing when we're in fact causing the exact same thing without even admitting it, talking about it honestly. So to talk about life as being grand and wonderful, that's true for life. It is not always true for human experience because there's plenty of frailty and vulnerability and weakness involved in the kind of behaviors that we're all witnessing that are not healthy. And to think of them as something we should accept is to deny the lack of health in them and to deny that we can have any productive, useful purpose in that process of healing that is possible. Not only possible, it's natural compared to this sort of dis-ease state that seems completely intractable and impossible on the global scale, because we're creating that in our own inner landscape, trying to escape the inner landscape with escapades and charades and all kinds of other pompous projections of images and imagery and narratives that aren't true, just to give ourselves some sense of space, when in fact it doesn't at all. It crowds us and suffocates our experience. So seeing what we're doing gives us a chance to start noticing what is wrong and not blame people for it, but see our culpability in all of it. Much different place to talk to from or express to people. And it isn't an easy transition to start speaking in those terms because it seems like a foreign language, which is why it seems so unintelligible to listen to it very often, which I hear a lot from people. They say, something feels right, but I don't understand what you're saying. So the thinking is struggling while the being is aware. The rightness of the being is confirmed, saying, I sense something that's right. The thinking says, how do I make sense of this within the context of how I've been trying to make no sense out of the sense I'm making for decades or whatever the time period might be. My experience is we've all had enough experience. We don't talk about it openly enough to have that experience. And that's part of the discipline I think the Stoics are referring to in terms of beginning to apply these practices with the people we're in touch with in ways that become examples rather than demands and obstacles to their own healing and their own growth and their own potential awareness being expressed. They've already got it. If they're not expressing it, our expression of it would certainly be an example that could be utilized, but it also can be a bit confounding to all of a sudden hear a language you've never really heard before or been involved in discussing. So part of that is what we're doing here is attempting to have a discussion based on principles that are revealing of the awareness we have of the defective nature of the thinking we do and seeing how common that is between us rather than something that's distinct to each of us and worthy of being hidden further and not talked about and not exposed and for fear of being found out, when my experience is that nobody's keeping a secret, because if you watch anybody in any honest way, you're seeing the dysfunctional behaviors constantly emanating out of them and the weaknesses and the self-consciousness, the seeming self-consciousness of a self that isn't even conscious. All those frailties and vulnerabilities and weaknesses are the anxiety and the struggles, the inner conflicts, the problems we bemoan, the plights we bemoan, all that kind of stuff is all evidence of that. It isn't hard to see if you're looking clearly. So if the story's immoral, compared to a moral story that has a principled basis where everybody can sit back and say, oh, I can understand that. Like the parables Jesus talked about. We're all designed to tell simple stories to reveal broad implications or awarenesses. I'm not sure I know how to do that well. But the difference between a moral story is the benefit, the global benefit, the absolute benefit, rather than the divisive idea that somehow we're going to divide people and conquer them at the same time. Silence is certainly evidence that we have no obligation here to do anything other than what we want to do. And reluctance is generally, first steps can often be reluctant and hesitant because they're first steps. Like any child that takes his first step, they're not generally very confident, but they're kind of wavering in it, but also recognizing the possibility of that step could lead to what everybody else seems to be doing so easily around them, walking and then talking. All those functional aspects of literacy, literally functional literacy, reading the body language, reading the room, reading the environment we're in accurately is the degree to which we're able to function literally, and reading the signs, the body language is the functional literacy of our inner awareness, that mental awareness we have the capability of using to an extraordinary degree rather than misusing to an extraordinary degree. So how could we develop that conversation together? Any ideas in that regard? Let's just say today, for instance.
Trying to practice these principles and report back, I guess. I don't know. One
How would
option.
that look? How would that look?
I don't know, just maybe it's just communicating back to you or to a group chat or to something else. Like an instance that happened last night, my daughter came in at 2:30 complaining of unbearable wrist pain. She sprained her wrist and didn't tell us or something, and my wife is up and at him and jumping on it. And I remember in the old days, I would have literally just freaked out because I was out of control in a way, or my thoughts are out of control. But we iced it. I found an old wrist splint that I had from my injuries back in the day and got her some Advil, and like went through the motions of a normal reaction, a response able,
Right.
instead of flying off the handle and driving her to the hospital, which maybe what I would have done before. I don't know. But, and then I calmly went back to sleep and said, we'll see how she is in the morning and see where we're at. Like, instead of tossing and turning all night, wondering, hoping, thinking, just reporting back about things that have changed. I mean, that's all we can do, Jack, right? Is communicate with each other as to failures and successes.
Well, and part of that is this sort of inner discussion we're having. We're either talking to our thoughts and thinking it's ourself, or we're talking to the universe and literally seeing that we have a knowing awareness that well transcends the limited thinking we do, that ends up being that intuitive wisdom that the Stoics are referring to, and that through history humans have been seeking and searching for. It's natural. And part of the growth in this doesn't feel like growth at all because it's natural. It feels so like I had a cast on my foot once for 6 weeks, and when they took it off, they realized it was infected, and I had to put it on for another 6 weeks.
Oh,
So I was in a cast for 14 weeks while I was broke the cast driving. I had a stick shift, and I mean it was frustrating. And I thought the whole time, I can't wait. And then the day I'm walking out of the hospital or the doctor's office, when it's off, I thought, well, this is normal. This is no big deal. That's the way it's supposed to be. And in a way, it's easy to overlook the growth and you're describing some perspective that you're aware of a way you used to do it and the way you're doing it now in this instance. But in the broader sense, those things, the parts we play is very, very small. If we're willing to concede reality is reality, that's a pretty simple step. And all of a sudden, there's a nature that starts to evolve that seems so natural. It doesn't seem like growth at all. It seems like, where was I when I thought this wasn't normal? And that thought tends not even to occur. So sometimes the growth comes from the interaction with other people because they can offer you perspective because we're all seeing things from a point of view that's distinct to the view we each have. But if we're seeing the unified aspect of that view from understanding for humans is how we see things that are invisible, which would be substantive.
I think it's an interaction thing, like it's a program of attraction.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, my parents would freak out if I spilled a glass of milk. I mean, like yelling and screaming. And so when my kids first spilled milk, I guess what I did. And I noticed it sort of right away, but just being taught or being in the presence of how other people can react or respond is helpful.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, and we're designed for that. We're actually designed to offer the perspective we have, not as an accusation or criticism. And criticism is not generally seen as instructive, but in fact, that's what it is. Any critic is giving insight into something that is somewhat educated and somewhat developed. So the idea of observing something that's wrong and stating that wrong as seen doesn't condemn anybody. And yet in that reactive state, it feels like an attack.
Yes.
Versus just being an opportunity to have to say, wow, oh, okay, I didn't even notice that I had actually done something significantly different. I can notice it maybe quicker than you can because you're in it and I'm out of it. And as you begin to see that you're really not in it, because the addictive thought is the idea that we're in our thinking, so we lose perspective and we lose any kind of value from what's happening because we seem blind to it and blind to everything else that's happening other than what we think. So my sense is you're describing the actual nature of this absolute interactive relationships that we all have. We're in a relationship with everything and everywhere, everything, all that is and all that are, we're interreacting with all the time, or interrelating with. Whether we're interreacting or interacting is the choice set on whether or not I think what I'm doing is right to the degree that it's the only right, rather than a flexible version of my best idea that I prefer. So something else I read this past week, which we've talked about, is that we have no obligation to conclude anything. And one of the natural reactive consequences of obsessive thinking and reactive thinking and impulsive thinking and compulsions is a conclusion that it's the only thing we can do. And so there's a desperation to come to the right conclusion typically in that process. So that's another indicator that can be used to say, oh, I do think I have an obligation to come to the right conclusion. Why would I have an obligation to come to the right conclusion if the rightness of rightness is already in existence, if I weren't thinking I was the one responsible for that rightness? Now, it doesn't discount my inability or ability to be right in terms of how things function in my human experience. But if I'm dysfunctioning at the most elementary level with what is right because I'm wrong in my thinking to begin with, I'm never going to get it right. I'm going to keep coming up with quick solutions to make believe that the immediate gratification of this idea that I've made a decision is going to serve me in the long run, when what it's doing is committing me to another fixed idea and another fixed belief that isn't fixed or even believable. It's creating a new layer of that same reactivity over and over and over again. And there's an intoxication to that because there's a lot of adrenaline attached to it, this sense of emergency and all that kind of stuff that can be very exciting and very consuming and intoxicating. So internally, we don't have to drink alcohol, take drugs, do those things to be abusing the chemical system that we already have. And the real substance abuse is thoughts lacking substance being thought of as substantive. That sets us off on a wild ride because our body knows that we are putting our experience in peril, and our instincts do not help us do things to get worse. They're trying to guide us in directions to help us act better and healthier for survival purposes, knowing that eventually the story we're living in this life form will come to an end. But in the meantime, it isn't doing everything it can to rush that date, but actually allow a greater experience so that we can interact with wisdom and the acquired experience we've had with each other to bring this next generation up in an environment that would seem conducive enough to want to be in. And right now we have suicide at almost every category of age, including single digits, at all-time highs. That's an environment we've created that people just don't want to be in. They don't know what to do. It's very disconcerting to be in the face of insanity and think sanely that there's anything we can do, because it wouldn't be sane to think about insanity in any sane way, except to see it as insane and something that is not reality. It's literally a delusion being thought of as reality. So the moral story is, as you're describing, principle. What are the principles? Now, evil's principle too. Do the wrong thing as right, you're going to create problems. That's a principle. It's always going to give us a consequence we're going to not want to admit we created, think we have nothing to do with, and as a result, continue to subject ourselves to it as though we don't have anything to do with it. That's the addictive nature. So those are principles too, but we're talking about affirmative principles in this, spiritual principles, absolute principles. And that's what the steps guide toward. Give us a chance to practice those. How do we practice? By interacting, applying, engaging. We're already engaged. If we're engaging proactively on that basis, we're looking for the opportunities to grow with people rather than condemn them and try to shrink wrap them and make them smaller so we can feel bigger. And as they get worse, we feel better because we're better than them. And if you listen to the conversation, it's talked about a lot. Openly, there but for the grace of God go I. As though God's grace is limited when it's actually the limited thinking that's causing that distinction. So God isn't disgracing. If that God we talk about is absolute and is just a word for that absolute essence, that essence doesn't see the insanity that we're left to seeing that because we're the creators of it. It's not a higher power coming down and reducing themselves to a lower level of functional capacity to condemn us. That's our own inability to be responsible for what we're doing and make believe that somehow or another God and life is to blame, when in fact we miss the opportunity to actually claim the blame and the responsibility and accountability honestly for what we're actually creating and manifesting in our own experience. None of us have to think of this in the same words, the same vocabulary, the same presentation to have that knowing awareness and express it in whatever way we do. Because the learning curve, putting it out there is the learning curve. Hiding it is the idea that what we're learning to do is keep it a secret, that we're doing the wrong thing, thinking someday it'll be right. It's easy to make believe by isolating and thinking about what you're doing in an isolated version of your day as though you can be isolated, but thinking you're staying at home, you're thinking to yourself, you're thinking about yourself, you're thinking about all these things as though they're the only thing you can do. You can come up with all kinds of conclusions that aren't right and maintain them because there's no interaction. There's no potential for that perspective. The perspective exists, but we're not going to find it by continuing to maintain ideas that are insane. The whole idea about that is to think we're not even doing what we're doing. So certainly we're not looking for what is actually happening. We're looking for the evidence that we can't do anything about it. So that's what we see. We look for what we find. We find what we look for. Another telltale sign of this interreaction is presuming that people are hearing what we're saying when they're hearing what they think we're saying. And if you listen to people's responses, very often you'll notice that they're not responding to what we said at all. They're off on another tangent of some sort, largely because they didn't hear what we said. They heard what they thought we said. And being locked in that addictive cycle, that's a natural outgrowth of that. So it's an easy thing to spot. And one way that in one-on-one stuff I do is ask people more, what did you just hear me say? And we've seen it in here quite a bit. I think Les was really honest about something he saw in Anthony, and Anthony took it as a compliment. And it was a very honest observation of something that I would say was not very complimentary. It was complimentary in the honesty of it, and the perspective, his perspective being honest, but how it was seen was a compliment. Like, yeah, I know I've really come a long way. But he wasn't pointing out the long way he'd come. He was pointing out something that was very defective. So beginning to do that with somebody begins to open our ears also to see that the value of their insight is actually offering us perspective in our own insight or lack of insight. It's very vibrant dynamic. Easier to do one-on-one than in a group, I have found, because I think our silence often witnesses. And though the silence is also a contemplation, you have no obligation to participate. And the participation is the listening, is the silence, is the sort of personal awareness per se, the distinct awareness we each have from our own thinking. In the thinking regard, it's distinct. So if we're looking at this honestly and growing, we're dissolving rather than resolving, and thinking of the New Year's celebration and all that sort of hubbub that goes along with the fact that the calendar that we created has ended for a single year and started again. Every day is a year from the day that date a year ago or the day before. Every day is. But the idea of resolutions are so readily seen as something that people are absolutely going to do now that it's a new year, and yet seem to only last about 3 weeks. The whole idea of now there's, what is it called? Dry January or something, where everybody gets sober for a month. if there's a benefit to it, it might be worth thinking of it as something year-round rather than a month and saying, okay, I've got this, and I can go back for 11 months and launch into that crusade. But the difference is there's nothing wrong with resolutions, but they're resolving. Why would they need to be resolved if there were really, why would a resolution need to be made if there was any solution, any real solution? Or disillusion, dissolving, meaning literally no need for solution because it's seen as something that was delusional to begin with. There's no real problem once we've come to terms with that. And that allows us to do the same thing and see it clearly without even having to think it's something we shouldn't be doing, because we'll be doing it when we're doing it. Thinking about an illusion, thinking about an imaginative idea that may have no basis in reality doesn't prevent us from thinking those things once we see that. But the distinction between thinking that imagination is reality and then condemning us to a seeming reality that is hostile and demanding is very different than seeing it as something we're just imagining things. What's something I could do that would be a great challenge and fun to realize? Very different approach to using imagination than feeling condemned by the ideas we have when we think of it as reality. And thinking itself is imaginative. It's an exploration, it's consideration, it's contemplative. And also highly analytical, because our brain is as good or better than any computer on earth. Always calculating, always processing, always digesting, but it is digesting reality while we are asking it to digest the imagination of reality that we have, which isn't reality at all. So it doesn't digest insanity well, just like the body doesn't digest whatever it is addicted to, whatever it feels it can't withdraw from. And the withdrawal symptoms from this form of thinking are often seeing the fear we've been creating honestly, and it can be a little overwhelming at first. To see it clearly is to have it process through our body and start to actually dissipate, literally dissolve, because now we're not insisting it be maintained, so it will naturally disappear. Doesn't have anything other than the appearance we gave it, so when we see it that way, it's gone. The tension's gone with it, and the fear that's held in our body, all that bile and all that stuff that's anti-health starts to release, and you'll feel it and witness it. And that is not always easy to do. It can be very disturbing. But the difference between seeing it as disturbing and thinking it's not disturbing is that you're actually honest about the seeing of it, so the dissipation of it happens automatically. Coming to terms with it honestly, rather than making believe, continuing to maintain the terms that are dishonest, is somehow going to turn into truth and reality at some point. We can't let go of what has us. So in the first part of the serenity step, grant me the serenity. We've already been granted the serenity, because the absolute nature doesn't become unabsolute when we think it can change and we think we're in control of it and we think we're the creator of it. It has no impact on it whatsoever. So we have the serenity to notice what doesn't change. And we already know it doesn't change, or we wouldn't be constantly trying to change it. We know its presence, and the futility of trying to change it makes it impossible. It is incredibly discouraging to our experience, which is where the courage comes in the second part of that. Do the things we can. Have the courage to do the things we can. Courage is natural when we're not acting in ways that are discouraging and disturbing and disruptive. By thinking content, a lack of content is the only content. That substance without any substance is, in fact, I think I said it earlier, it's the ultimate substance abuse, is the idea that a lie has substance, that a lie has power. It doesn't. It has an incredibly destabilizing impact on our mentality when we think it's real, but it's no different than a dream having a nightmare when we think we're in it. Feels very real. Our body reacts just as though it is real. But it's a manifest of an effect that we're capable of creating as a guidance system to help us understand what is right, what is possible, what is wrong, what is impossible. And I mean possible in ways that aren't corrupt and have a 30-year lifespan of looking great before we realize that there's a really toxic consequence that we've been ignoring the whole time. Utilizing nature as natural rather than utilizing it in some contrived way that looks good for the meantime, just as we try to appear good on a daily basis when we're struggling with what's wrong and bad and not talking about it, not opening up to it. Thinking it's hidden, and there is nothing hidden in this universe, nothing. We don't have to understand it for it to know exactly what it's doing, to be doing it now, to have this moment even possible to even talk about it. Something I mentioned to Mark this week, who's had some amazing insights. We spent several days today walking on the beach and for this week, is to listen, if you have the time, if you want to take the time to listen to the episode, if you participated in it, listen to it and see the difference in how it sounds when you're not here now, with the potential of talking and sharing. Listen to the experience of it. And it tends to be much different when you're just listening, when you're seemingly a bystander to it. And there seems to be some pressure. Anthony's referred to it multiple times, just feeling when the recording comes on, he feels like a little less willing to talk openly, a little hesitant. And my sense is the whole purpose of this discussion is that it isn't happening socially enough to have the impact it could to allow the policies and the thinking to continue that are causing the problem while claiming to be solving the problem so blatantly, so obviously, and so proactively. My sense is we're perfectly capable of having that conversation socially, and it starts by having it as you were describing, Gabe. One-on-one, two-on-two, whatever the number is, and starting to just talk about it and open it up. If people don't understand it, they can always listen to an episode themselves, and maybe they hear something in my words, maybe they hear something in any of the words that are spoken that hit them in a way that aren't exactly what they would say, but are exactly what they know to be. And that awareness is the point of this discussion, is to start to notice that you have a sense of right, a sense of wrong. And the sense of right is never going to feel conflicted. It's never going to feel damning. It's never going to feel like you've got to hang on to it. You just know you know it. And getting used to that is beginning to identify your absolute knowing self, the absolute self that we all share, not the one that we are each, and see the thinking in relation to it as something that seems to be distinct to it, because the thinking is coming from a brain in a body. And the knowing is not coming from anything in space and time. It's just an absolute state of being. And that is not a grandiose idea. The grandiose idea is that that isn't true. If this is the nature of nature, then that's the nature of things, not the nature that we believe in or think we need to contrive. Any other thoughts before we sign off?
I was thinking, hi guys, good morning, everybody.
Hey, Santiago.
I was thinking, reflecting the other day in why I was drinking, why I was drinking. And was an attempt to get out of pain. I think in my case, addiction goes with trying to escape from pain, trying to escape from that dreadful black loneliness where you see that I am condemned to nothing. So I was asking myself, where that fear, that dreadful loneliness comes from? And I think it comes from not accepting what it is. And this connects to the beginning of your talk about the Stoics, because our serenity prayer is really connected to Stoics, because one of the principles of living a Stoic life is two kind of things: the things you can control and the things you cannot control. Why to worry? Why to suffer for things I cannot control? And that is precisely where the other part of our program of surrendering and accept what it is with faith, that even though if it doesn't make sense in my little mind, my higher power knows better. And I think when I accept that, fear and that dreadful loneliness backs off. And then I can be smelling the roses or be in the present. I had an illness and I accepted. And 7 months later, when I got good news that my illness was gone, I was feeling myself full of fear and anxiety. And I realized it's because once when I knew, okay, I have what maybe is a final illness, and I accepted, I could smell the flowers every day. But when I didn't know, oh, is this going to come back? Is this going to show up again? And I was living in the imaginative insecurity, because truly, who knows what is going to happen half hour from now? Nobody. But we think that, oh, I know what is going to happen. At 12:30, I'm going to have lunch with Jack, and then I'm going to have a walk in the beach, and then come back home. Well, maybe not. So the radical acceptance of what I can control and what I cannot control is for me the door to freedom. Because if I accept, I don't know if illness is going to come back or no. I accept that I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I accept that I am this or that. I accept that my daughter had that problem that you were talking about. In that acceptance is a surrender. I'm sorry about my English. Is surrendering. Surrender my idea that I am more than I am, and I am plenty. But to be that, I have to be right here, not in the masking my fear with drugs, alcohol, or whatever. Because it's money, it's sex, it's prestige, it's even depression. Oh, I am so depressed. Oh, I am so depressed I cannot do anything. That is also a mask that we put on not to swallow what we need to swallow. And the thing is, when I swallow what I need to swallow, I am very free to smell the flowers and to see the magic that is in every minute. So what I control and what I cannot control, what I can change and what I cannot change.
It's interesting that we seem within the addiction to fight for the thing that we cannot change as something we can change, and we end up not changing the things we can change. The whole thing flips backward. And my sense is, Santiago, that the fear you're describing is, in fact, our instinctive drive in our body is to survive. And it's our body's awareness that we're doing things that are causing a threat to that survival. And the fear is a legitimate induced state of awareness, like a guidance system. Like the woman say on the I always try to beat the GPS. So she's always saying, go back to the root, go back to the root, go back to the root. And interesting in our thinking, the root of our thinking, if I think my thinking is reality, is corrupt from the beginning. So all the other thinking I'm doing about it is putting my experience at risk. Because I'm not thinking right. I'm not thinking well. I'm thinking about overthinking as being the solution and thinking more about this and more about that. I'm thinking I'm not present because I'm consumed and intoxicated with those thoughts. So I'm present thinking I'm not present. And literally thinking my thoughts are so powerful because they're lies, but I'm thinking of them as having power enough to distract me from being present rather than see that I'm simply present, thinking I'm not present, and starting to see the insanity of that makeup. Literally made up. And when you mention radical honesty, consider that when we begin to accept things, we're finally just conceding that they're the way they are, regardless whether we accept them or not. That things are always how they are. And it doesn't require us to think about them for them to be that way. Exactly as an absolute source is always as it is, and it doesn't change regardless of how we think of life and love and light and all of the other variations of things that we assign this idea of God to, this higher essence, as though that essence has nothing to do with us. It's somewhere else. We need to elicit it to do for us what it wouldn't do if we don't ask. When it's already being done, it's already here, it's already absolute in our state and absolute in our awareness. So, and I think the point you talked about swallowing, the big book says that we will have to swallow some big chunks. The chunks are really food for thought, coming to terms with the fact that they're fully digestible and they are nurturing and nutrition. If we're willing to have them as they are, we're willing to get the benefit from them, no matter how sick we thought they were. They become digestible and help us to grow. There's no lack in any of it, no matter how committed we are to the ideas that tell us that they are. And I think your process has been incredibly honorable. I mean, I know we spoke about it when you first were diagnosed and really started looking at things differently and had some shifts in your own understanding of your own understanding that were pretty dramatic. So I'm glad a rose can be a rose, as a rose is a rose is a rose, as Gertrude Stein said. You can smell the flowers now rather than overlook it. My sense is that's the sweetness, the bounty, the absolute nature of the nature that we always have, that we discount and think because we're consumed and intoxicated with thoughts in another direction that somehow or another, I'm not part of it and it's not part of me anymore. Very self-serving, induced self-serving idea to make believe the only thing I can do, as you described, the only thing I can do is just keep doing it in the insanity. That's all I can do. Interesting, we could be so conclusive about doing the wrong thing is the only thing we can do, rather than concede that maybe the right thing is always available. And it's just my preoccupation with trying to defend the thoughts I'm having that aren't right and will always be wrong. And I think they are right and wonder why I'm in a constant conflict internally that I can't seem to get out of. So I'm happy to hear your progress, your process. And I think our mental state, no anxiety helps any disease in our body get better. And I suspect that mental illness and this mental anxiety that we induce is exactly what allows our body to become weak enough to become susceptible. And as we get older, that becomes more and more natural because it's naturally going through a disintegrative process. We have a natural end that comes. We do not need to speed it up to prove we're in control of life. When it isn't life we're trying to control, it's the thoughts we have. Another thought I had for you when you started is to consider that the mind isn't our brain. We talk about it that way because we suppose it's the creator of reality. But if mind, pure consciousness, infinite knowingness is in fact not our brain, but the nature of the entire universe, then it's probably not limited to the universe. If the universe is limited, and I would suggest if the universe is expanding, that's a certain admission that wherever it is right now is limited if it has anywhere to grow. So it's a great metaphor for our capacity within thinking to allow that thinking to expand and begin to embrace in broader terms an infinite source that we can never seem to get to. If the universe is doing it, that might be good for us too. And I think the book talks about progress rather than perfection. And in the human scape, we can know that there's an absolute source that isn't going to change and start operating on a human basis that becomes obviously frail in many ways and vulnerable based on ideas that aren't true, and start to immediately, intuitively, interact in ways that are absolutely aligned with everything rather than busy trying to take our malign thinking and straighten it out, rather than just see it as something we don't have any obligation to continue doing. And the beauty of it becomes very obvious quickly, a lot quicker than it would have taken us to ever think our way to get there, because it's already here. It's always here. It's always present. So when I started thinking of the brain as something that thinks and something we have, because the old gurus that I read said, we are not our body, we are not our thoughts, but where are our thoughts coming from but our body, our brain in our body? And the big book talks about that as mind. And I think the distinction between thinking as a brain function and knowing is a function of an absolute state of being. We're human beings, that's our being aspect, and the human aspect is intimately woven into that. That spirit can't be in us without being without us too at the same time, which seems contradictory to rational thought. But in fact, within the confines of rational thought, everything has to add up rationally, when in fact an absolute nature is completely abstract, or we wouldn't have the paradoxes that talk about giving it away to keep it, and dying to live, surrendering to win. All those are backward from the rational construct that we create, but they're absolute inherent. And my sense is the paradoxes aren't even paradoxes, except to the presumption that the human experience is natural, and the abstract of an infinite source is some rare thing that we occasionally consider, when in fact the absolute state is in fact reality and natural. It is the essence of nature. And the real paradox is that we think that paradoxes are paradoxical rather than evidence. We give it away to keep it. It means that we could give it all away to have it. That's an infinite source, because an infinite source, if you oppose an infinite source, it's still infinite. The opposite of it is the same. The opposite of having everything in human terms is having nothing. So the real paradox is that we think paradoxes are paradoxical. Anyway, I diverge, perhaps. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Parting blows? Any new jokes, Jackie?
Yeah, but they're not appropriate.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay, ready?
I checked the explicit box now so that we can say things that may seem out of character. I think it's interesting that we think of some words as being obscene.
Right.
when they're just words. So what do you got?
I wish I was uber rich, so every time I passed an unhoused person, I could give them $100 instead of just crop dusting them.
With the exhaust of the car?
No, my butt.
Oh. Crap dusting.
Yeah. Thank you. Want to hear a street joke?
Of course.
How do you get your husband to stop stumbling around the front yard?
Oh,
Shoot him again.
That's sadly funny.
It's funny how much funnier it is than if you said wife.
Yes. Well, there again, you can see that there's great inequity in our imagination too, or maybe exclusively.
Right. You're like,
Yeah.
oh no, if it's the wife. That's funny.
Yeah. Well, I love you guys. I appreciate you, and look forward to doing this again as we do during the week very often. Between some of it, we walk on Saturdays, and anybody in LA is welcome to come with us too. By the way, if you want to fly in, you're welcome. 7:00 in the morning on Saturday to walk the beach for an hour or so and chit chat, talk about this one-on-one. I may do some local meetings here in LA in the a building down the street, get some chairs and actually sit down and talk about this and see if there's any distinction between the Zoom and face to face. I think sometimes it can be a little easier to talk, and maybe the opposite is also true. But those are some thoughts I'm having.
Exciting.
Yeah, and your Saturdays are still busy, aren't they, Jackie?
They've opened up a little bit.
Okay. All right. Because I
Yeah.
thought of you in relation to that. So that may be when we do it, but I'll talk to everybody and see if there isn't some kind of consensus. And I love you guys. I appreciate this. It gives me a chance to do what you were talking about, Gabe, is just function in a way that actually employs the words and can look at them critically enough to be considerate as to whether or not they're getting the message across, and also realize that if the absolute nature of nature is natural, we already have it. And it's not up to my words to get it there, but to remember that everybody has it and see it in that regard. And I think that knowingness is the greatest conveyor, because it allows, as Santiago was talking about acceptance, it allows what's happening to be happening, because what's happening is always happening. And it's always been happening how it's been happening, never how I thought it was. And even the things I think I can predict, like having lunch, as Santiago pointed out, having lunch or doing something, is never done in the way I predict it will be. There's always some variation in the process of getting there. We may end up having lunch together, but there's always going to be random occurrences that are involved that I'm not predicting and not even thinking about, and I'm kind of used to. So if I can be used to that sort of variation, why not get used to the variation of looking out there and realizing that I don't have to be conclusive and definitive of everything that's happening for it to be happening as it's happening, and come to terms with the fact that I know everything's happening exactly the way it's happening, and start to realize that that is actually speaking for everything. And now what else is there to really think about? I'm a little more free than thinking I've got to sort that stuff out and get it right, think about it perfectly to get it to that place, rather than see that every time I do that, it never goes there. May in general ways, but not in all ways. So anyway, love you guys. See you around campus.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jack.
see you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very much.
everybody.
Love
Good to
you.
see you all.
Aloha, Nui.
Love you. Aloha.
Bye.
Bye.